Iris Emily. I was surprised to find I only had 10 photos, recording the first 20 years of my mother's life. She does look a bit grumpy in those 2 classroom photos. Strangely, I thought I had many more photos of her in later years than I can actually find. I think some files have gone missing. I was quite delighted to see these 2 photos. 59 years apart. Mum used to have eyebrows, but I never saw them. She said a friend had plucked her eyebrows and they never grew again. So attempting to get the same orientation in the photos, I've cropped from other photos. In 2003, when Mum died, it was a whirlwind. And I think I did what I always did, and I pushed my emotions away while I dealt with the practicalities. But now I think it's time to find out the what, the why, how and who of mourning and grief. So I begin by asking Mum. I have her journals and she can tell me how she taught me about grief. So Mum wrote, but despite the break in my early lifestyle, losing my mother so young, I grew up quite a totally uncomplicated child, easily adapting to whatever changes came into my life. The only difficulty I had, I could never understand the devastation quite mature people felt with the deaths of their parents, always feeling they should appreciate having them for so long. It was almost 50 years before that grief touched me with the loss of my sister Nell so suddenly. I don't think I appreciated that Auntie Nell's dying rather dramatically during my father's 50th birthday had touched her so deeply. By then I'd been living 280 kilometres away for quite a long time, and only seeing her 2 or 3 times a year. I didn't attend Mum's funeral. She was taken on the funeral train from Rockdale to Sutherland, Warrenora Cemetery. Mum's good friend Mrs. Townsend cared for me that day, but without thinking, took me to Rockdale. So wrote my mother. She continued with, I saw the train and knew what it was, and that my mother was on it, and I would never see her again. As was the practice in those days, the mourners had gathered near our house and marched to Rockdale station to board the train. However, some time later, she spoke to her older sister. Her version wasn't quite correct. It seems that her mother had been brought back to Segino Street briefly when it was time to go to the cemetery at 3 p.m. The undertaker and the pallbearers carried her coffin out to the hearse. The hearse moved off extremely slowly, Auntie Vera said. The mourning car with Dada, Sadie, Nell and Vera on board following. Bill, that's her brother, was with his young friends, and relatives walked single file each side of the hearse all the way to the Rockdale station for the funeral train. Auntie Vera says that the Reverend Owen officiated at a service in the home before going to Warrenora Cemetery, where there was a graveside service. It's funny, Mum's death, she says, was covered by 2 insurance policies. One was for £30 and another for 30 shillings. She records that her mum died at the Home of Peace in Marrickville. Now, it may seem strange that I start talking about a hospitalisation when I'm talking about my mother's death and anniversary, but it's to provide context from when my Nana died. And I find my memories are inaccurate too. From my mum's journal, she wrote, "For some time, Carolyn and Robin had been getting infected throats and tonsillitis, and the doctor decided they couldn't keep on having medication and it would be best to remove their tonsils and adenoids. It would be done at Hurstville Community Hospital on October the 18th. The problem was that at the same time, Ivan's mother, my Nana, became very ill and went to hospital. This rather astounded me because I always had the impression that we got our tonsils out for some sort of normal, everyone gets their tonsils out reason that happened in the 50s. And worse still, that my sister had her tonsils removed to keep me company. But she didn't really need them removed. I remember seeing my father crying and Mum saying his mother had died. I don't remember anything about it being my Nana. It always felt like I had no role or right to be grieving. So it seems like the beginning of a pattern in my life of one event being overshadowed by another and then being pushed away. So at the same time as Ivan's mother became very ill and went to hospital, the RPA, Ivan came home very distressed after visiting her on Saturday. She was in a coma and didn't know him. We both went in on Sunday, as well as the other family members. She was very low and died Sunday night, October 17, 1954. Ivan was devastated. Nothing I said made any difference. He wanted to cancel the girls' operations. I argued against that, apart from what effect changing the date might have on them. I felt something else to concern himself about might help. He was grieving so badly. We were having very bad weather and the funeral day was changed, otherwise it would have been on her birthday, which was October the 19th. My mother notes that she personally could not have coped with that. So the girls had their operations and would be kept overnight. Robin was all right, but Carolyn hemorrhaged and had to have a blood transfusion. I was phoning every half hour for her progress. It had been arranged for those who wanted to go to see the funeral parlour for some ceremony with Mum. I truthfully admit I didn't understand Ivan's grief. How could I? But I did know I needed him to be with me during this night while our little girl was in so much danger. He stayed with me, thank God. Mum's requiem mass and funeral were very big and very traumatic, particularly the grief of her sons. Back at the house, there were so many people, so much food, and so much noise. I had to get outside. Jack was there, I remember saying, "That's not my way of grief." He agreed with me. Ivan didn't come inside at all. Uncle Jack was the eldest brother. There is so much here I didn't know. Mum being fearful for my life, phoning every half hour, and this would have meant her going to the public phone box on the corner of the street. I had no appreciation of her supporting her husband, who was so devastated at the death of his mother. But she was needing his support. She was dealing with the complex emotions of so many people grieving and being part of a Catholic Mass when she wasn't Catholic. I had no appreciation of my dad wanting to stop the operation. I always thought it was rather callous of them, to send us off to have an operation while they went to a funeral. So we picked up our two daughters. Robin recovered well, Carolyn didn't, and a week later I had to rush her back to hospital. She had been bleeding all night. I didn't know until she started to vomit when a neighbour, Faith Clemson, minded Robin, and Dot McCarroll came in the ambulance with me. This time the doctor fixed everything. I saw her before going home. I would have loved to cuddle her, but I couldn't get close, or I wouldn't have got away. She spent a few more days in hospital and recovered all night. I did wonder what else was going to happen to her. I always believed I was alone in that ambulance. So sad for us both that she didn't cuddle me, as I didn't even remember her being there. My memory of that time has always been of laying there for hours with a nurse reprimanding me if I moved my leg, as blood was being transfused into my ankle. The scar with 3 stitches is still visible. I was the same age as my mother was when her mother had died. And then 9 weeks afterwards, New Year's Eve, Ivan wanted to go to Earlwood, to Mick and Joyce Leven's home, just to see the new year in. We'd never left the girls alone. We were 6 and 7. They were asleep. He had the David Jones van, so we sneaked out. I suppose we were gone 1.5 hours at the most, came home to find them sitting on one of their beds, arms wrapped around each other, crying as if their hearts would break. They thought we'd left them. Why ever did they think that? But they did. Yes, I remember that desperate cuddle with my little sister and our parents coming home unable, it seemed, to comprehend how we could have felt abandoned. They didn't realise we'd woken as soon as the David Jones delivery truck had backed out of the driveway. I remember it feeling like a long, long time before we heard it return. So how long does grief last? Well, Dad was still grieving after 4 months. Mum felt he shut us out, particularly her. She writes about the 9th wedding anniversary. Wasn't particularly joyful. Ivan was still grieving for his mother. I told him it was time he let his mother go. Jack and Roy had, his brothers. At Christmas time, which would have been only 9 weeks later, if that, we all went to Clarence Street for Christmas tea. It was so different without Mum. I never, ever went there again. It was sad this had happened, for even though we complained about having to come each year, we really did enjoy being together. And the 3 brothers enjoyed playing with the toys, especially the mechanical ones. For a few Christmas afternoons or Boxing Days, we tried picnics, but it really didn't work. So her mother had died of stomach cancer 3 months after she'd turned 7. My mother remembers she was sick for 6 months, mostly at home with some trips to hospital. She always had very long hair and it had been cut. She didn't seem to be like my mother and it frightened me. Perhaps my instinct was telling me things were going to change. I remember my aunts, her sisters, putting large arum lily leaves on her. Whatever did they expect to happen? Also hearing some aunts saying, because my mother had me at 40 years of age, the afterbirth hadn't come away, causing cancer. And she queries this. Didn't they know babies came from the womb and it isn't connected to the stomach? However, at the time as a 7-year-old, I'm sure hearing about her mother dying because the afterbirth hadn't come away when she was born might just have engendered some guilt and feelings of responsibility and affected how she grieved. So her mother had been ill for 7 months, whereas her mother-in-law's death was very sudden. So my mother wrote, after Mum had died, I started Sunday school at the Banksia Free Church. I attended there till I was 12 with my good friend Vi. Her surname was Ridding and she married and became Hancock. At school I became the little girl without a mother. I was different, but then my friend Vi didn't have a father. I never knew why. It wasn't discussed. Perhaps there had been a divorce, a rare thing in those days. Vi and I kept together a lot. Before Mother's Day, which was only about 6 weeks after Mum's death, the children in my class were making gifts for their mothers. The teacher told me not to bother. I hadn't a mother to give it to. Oh, so thoughtless. Teachers used to quiz us a bit to check we were being properly cared for, I suppose. Sadie, that's her older sister. She was 18 years older than my mum. Sadie visited Mum's grave every week, always taking me with her. I wished she had talked to me about Mum. No one ever did. Each time we went, she would sit by the grave, crying and asking to be taken too. Who needed a mother, a 25-year-old woman or a 7-year-old child? I realised very early tears came easily to Sadie. She always considered she reared me from my point of view. She did not. I was part of a family unit. No mother, granted, but a father, brothers and 3 sisters. In the family unit I was cared for, did small jobs that were allotted to me and just grew up. But no one ever seemed to tell me anything. I wonder whether that happens in other families, especially when the youngest is so much younger. I feel it makes you observe more, perhaps listen more, and certainly think more. Many years later, a friend asked me who had reared me. I explained what I've just written. She agreed with me. I doubt Sadie would have. Each person in our family unit helped it to function. She was denied the right to grieve, or even taught how to grieve. Elsewhere, my mother writes about never talking to her father and not being close. So here she was, wishing her sister had talked to her. No wonder she found it hard seeing her 31-year-old husband safely home from World War II, so devastated by his mother's death 4 months later. It was an exciting day. Whatever problems had disappeared. Cars were a little late, but I don't think Ivan would have worried. He knew my mum would come. And so they were married. They were happy with the photos. The reception was fine, except for one thing. Beer was not available, much to Dad's displeasure. A friend had made the cake, and they returned to Clarence Street to change, leaving a terrible mess there of confetti. She didn't throw her bouquet, but gave it to Sadie, her older sister, to place it on her mum's grave. Her mother-in-law had made her a tiny feather and straw hat to match a very pretty deep blue dress she had bought. My nana was a milliner, actually. A cab took them to Circular Quay, where they caught the ferry to Manly. Kisses, hugs, best wishes, advice from any and everyone. Ivan's Uncle Ern pressed a little box into her hand. It was a block of Cadbury's Energy chocolate. Ivan thought it hilarious. It took my mum years to forgive Uncle Ern. I was with my mum. She had had a heart attack. I gave her CPR. We had been packing to take her to hospital. Her doctor had referred her to hospital on the Monday to have her potassium levels monitored, and it was 4 o'clock on Friday. While packing, she said, "I feel faint," and came to sit down on the bed beside me, but keeled over to the left and landed between her bedside table and bed. I rang for the ambulance. I had spent weeks organising a roster of my adult children to make sure their nana was looked after while I was away. And then I spent the next 2 weeks in a state of numbness that seems to follow death for the bereaved, during which I organised a funeral, contacted people. A granddaughter was born the following Monday, and on schedule, 2 weeks later I left for the 3 months holiday overseas to places that I'd dreamed about. I was still numb. It's funny, the parallels in people's lives. Mum wrote about the local priest, Father Rafferty, who visited her mother. Her mother had a dear friend, a devout Catholic, Mrs. Wally. She probably told Father Rafferty about my grandmother. Everyone loved him, but she writes he was too modern, wearing creams to play cricket, giving so much of himself. And she understood that the church hierarchy transferred him to the country. They were jealous of his popularity. Anyway, she notes he visited Mum every week, while Mum's own minister, Reverend Pitt Owen, never came. My mother wonders how that must have hurt her own mother. She must have known she was dying, concerned about her family, especially Vera, who was only 17, and me at 7. She notes how she wasn't close to her dad, and there's quite a lot in her journals about this. But my mum had her own friendly local priest, my parish priest, Father Burney, who used to visit her and who conducted her funeral. There were many mentions of Burney in her journals.
I welcome you this morning as we come to acknowledge the life of Iris. In many ways, we do experience the beauty of her life throughout our lives. And because of that, we do experience a sense of little sadness, because we will not be able to communicate with her in the way that we have been able to do before. But as you will see in some of the writings that she has put down in the journals for us, that she saw the journey of life and she lived it. She faced hardships and she overcame them. And she experienced a real sense of joy at making the best of each day. And so we just want to come with a sense of thanksgiving for her. And I just, first of all, just like to begin by just conscious of the area of Christ's presence as he just allowed. We just pray, Lord Jesus, just come and just be with us and just fill us with a great sense of love and joy and peace. A real sense of thankfulness too, Lord, for the fact that we were privileged to have experienced the presence of Iris in our lives. We pray too, Lord, for the community, particularly for Carolyn and Robin, Iris's daughters, and Carolyn's husband Peter and Robin's husband Paul. Paul's not able to be with us today because of ill health. We realized then that Iris was the nana, and I suppose the nana-in-law, as I've made up a little one, first of all of David, and then Rebecca and Kim, Nathan and Jane, Michael, Luke, Julie and Peter, Ben and his fiancée Betsy, and Sally. It was a great nana of Jessica, Nicholas, Addison, Ethan, Brooke, Paris, and we have the youngest one whom you can just hear today. This is an amazing event that Charlotte Emily Rose was born on the 29th of September, 2 days ago. Just something like 38 hours old, and here today with us. So we see the whole aspect of family today, because a great friend of many. And just to allow us then to think a little bit about Iris and focus our thoughts there, I'm just going to invite now, Robin's going to bring forward a number of little symbols that allow us to reflect upon Iris. The first of the symbols is the photo of Ivan, her beloved husband who has predeceased Iris. Then we're going to look at the area of communication that Iris was just so important to her, the hours on the telephone and the letter writing to her friends and family. And the most amazing fact is the area of the very, very evidence of the journals that an account of her life.
Of course, there were other pressures that had begun decades earlier. I remember the letter I had received. If not consciously, unconsciously I knew how I was expected to behave. I was given a lecture very early on in my relationship. When I think of it now, I think how weird. The third letter someone writes to a person when they're supposed to be writing love letters describes how they should behave if their very young mother should die. Somehow or other I must have been considered far too stupid to actually have realised death was inevitable. I was a very religious young woman, child, teenager, all through my adulthood. I did not need anyone to explain it to me. I'm not sure how my mother would have felt if she'd known that her son-in-law actually believed she was destined for hell. Though that's not quite true, because she made quite a lot of references in her journals about religion and people who were like this. I so wish I had shown her this letter. But I never did. I can't avoid showing a photo of my mum with a cat. She loved her cats, and I loved Patchy. He was my cat as far as I was concerned. I used to study laying on the floor, and Patchy had come and sleep on the crook of my back. I've enjoyed meeting my mother this past week, in her journals and in my thoughts. And my promise is to fulfil my intention to digitise her journals so others who loved her can again meet with her. Any restraint in my emotions has been resolved. I feel free to love her, and in